A very warm welcome to our next edition of our series Leaders for Humanity, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have with us today Blaine Fowers, a professor for philosophical psychology. Blaine, a very warm welcome here from Europe.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
It's wonderful. And the topic for today's series is friendship, justice, and social order. And it's all going to be about a very interesting endeavor that has taken Blaine a significant amount of effort, time, and I'm sure nerves to develop an emergent theory of natural ethics. And a lot more about that will follow very shortly. But as usual, I will briefly introduce the floor and the inquiry, the project that we are both on, and then Antoinette will properly introduce Blaine right afterwards. So the floor for the session today will be brief setting the scene. What is good organizations all about? Secondly, introduction of Blaine and a few personal thoughts about what the good life is for Blaine, for him and his work. And then we will start the critical dialogue on, as usual, how to create better organizations using some of the insights that come out of Blaine's work. And here, a few words again on our good organizations inquiry. What is it all about? We are trying to understand how organizations can become good in today's fast-moving, ever-changing, and ever more problematic and tension, full of tensions, where leaders and managers are very often facing difficult questions in their organizations. How can organizations become good actors and fulfill their role in society? How can organizations be containers for communities and constituencies that they engage with to enable the flourishing in the wider ecosystems? And finally, how can organizations become breeding grounds for individual flourishing? All of this we're trying to investigate with a transdisciplinary group of researchers, academics, consultants, and special leaders who can offer bridging between practice and theory. And therefore, again, we're very happy to have Blaine with us, who certainly in his work is trying to become, to look at things across boundaries between evolutionary science, philosophy, psychology, and the implications on wider society. And with that, I will hand over immediately to Antoinette for a proper introduction of Blaine Fowers.
Yeah, I'm very excited that we have Blaine with us. And whilst I could go through the list here, which is of course already quite impressive, so especially if we look a Lifetime Achievement Award, that's probably what every scholar always would like to have. And also the Joseph B. Gittler Award for contributions to the philosophical foundations of psychology. I would rather like to point out even more that he is again a bridge builder. We see that with this network on research on morality, which is an interdisciplinary endeavor, difficult enough because us academics usually stay in our own silos. So it's very nice that you have brought a lot of different disciplines together for that important topic. But of course, I also find it intriguing because this is a psychologist who knows virtue ethics as good as psychology. And I would say that's already a rare species in itself, I guess so. I mean, if I look at my own field at least. What I also especially like is that you operationalized virtue in a way where most virtue theories probably would make their peace with. I would say so. And I think that's rather difficult because we went through all the different measurements and often there was a lot of criticism from virtue theories. I'm also quite delighted that as an OB researcher, I was kind of craving for that type of precision you always have to bring up if you try to measure something. So for me, that was a really nice bridge. And I also believe that this opens up really further bridge building, for instance, to the field of social psychology, to also what we want to do, namely the operationalization of virtues in organizations. So I found that very, very helpful. I would also say, but that's something we're going to dive in later, that is one of the few secular accounts of virtue ethics I have read so far, because usually it's still very much ingrained, for instance, with Catholic social teachings. I find that very interesting to see that coming up. And of course, already in the title is this very courageous leap into the natural ethics part, as suggested by Aristoteles, which is a big endeavor, I would say so. But I think enough from my side, because it's always very difficult to do somebody justice. And that's why I would like to ask you, as a first thing, if you would put yourself into a few words and would describe yourself in a nutshell, what would you say about yourself?
Well, first of all, let me just thank you for that very kind introduction. And I really appreciate it. It's, as an academic, all of us work for years and years, and we often feel like we're toiling in darkness. And so when someone notices your work and then applauds it, it's very gratifying. I think one of the things that's interesting is that I see myself at the same time as a maverick, someone who pursues questions in a way that is not necessarily standard and doesn't follow any pre-designed path. And yet I feel so much a part of the zeitgeist. That's a nice German word that's made its way into the English vocabulary. When I look around, there are a lot of people thinking in similar ways and working in similar directions. And you mentioned the interdisciplinarity of my work. In the beginning, say 20 years ago, I had a couple of philosopher friends and that was it. And they would talk to me and they would correct me all the time. And I would listen and try to take in what they would say. But in the last 10 years, this interdisciplinarity has emerged in a powerful way. And I go to a lot of meetings now that are interdisciplinary and people talk to each other across the disciplines. And there's a kind of goodwill and interest and open-mindedness that just didn't exist 10 years ago, except in a few people. And I was actually reminiscing about that with a friend of mine, Tal Brewer, who's at the University of Virginia as a philosopher. And we were talking about our first effort and how ham-handed it was in 2011. And yet here we were at the University of Virginia again, talking as though we were old friends, and well, we are old friends now, but a lot of people were talking that way. And people I had just met were interested in a psychological point of view from a philosophical discipline, and vice versa. And so it's been really gratifying to see that happen. And for the longest time, no one understood me and everyone criticized me. So now I have more and more friends across the disciplines. So along that, let me just mention that one of the things I started a little under 2 years ago was the Network for Research on Morality, which is a gathering place for people from multiple disciplines. So we have psychologists, philosophers, sociologists, people in business, people in medicine, people in law, and even more disciplines. Education is another pretty big one, who are interested in understanding morality better and studying it from a scholarly point of view. If you're interested in that grouping and would like to be included in our listserv, just send me an email at bfowers@miami.edu. I'm sure that Antoinette and Otti will make that available. So that's all you have to do. It's a very low bar to enter. You just have to be interested and serious. So you don't have to do any kind of demonstration, or I don't vet people particularly. If people are interested, I'm interested.
Perfect.
That sounds very good. And I think I will list myself in your survey if possible. I want to ask you a bit of a cheeky question, if I may, still in the section about who is Blaine, so to speak. You have dedicated your life trying to understand ethics and also trying to understand human nature and combining the two. We had a lovely friend of ours in the series, Bill Torbett, a few weeks ago. And Bill said, the good life is about good questions, good friends, good work, good money, in this order. If you had for yourself to frame the good life in a sentence, what would it be?
Well, I'm a pretty devoted follower of Aristotle. So I would say that the good life is living excellently as a rational social being. So that's the quick sentence. Now I can give you hours and hours on what that means, of course, but the basic idea is he used what he called the function argument, which is the way to understand what's good for any being is to understand its nature. And he said that our nature was as social rational beings. And so a lot of the categories that the friend you mentioned used would fit within that framework, that we're social down to our bones. There's no part of us that's not social. And then we're also rational. And what Aristotle meant by that is we have reasons for what we do. We do things because we think they're good things, because we think they're worthwhile. And if someone asks us, we can tell them what our reasons are. Sometimes we're a little confused, or we might even be misguided, but we always can explain why we're doing what we're doing. And if we can't, it's a problem for us because we believe we should be able to do that. So I think those are some pretty good criteria. There's a lot of specifics. I mean, we can drill down on any of these things, like I say, for a very long time, but that's the basic one sentence answer.
And because I think we try to get a little bit more personal here, because we are going to drill down into your questions.
Okay.
If you think about yourself, if you would order it, is it still the rational social being, or is it the social rational being? So where would you put your emphasis on?
Wow, it's really hard to prioritize it because, of course, as an academic, I'm really into the reason side. And it's really important to me to understand and explain things in a way that makes sense and that seem to get right what it is I'm interested in. And so that's huge. And my work is a big part of a good life. At the same time, I have a lovely family and a set of friends that are very dear to me. And the good news is that these friends are mostly people who are scholars like me, so we work together. So it's really easy to combine the social and the rational. Although, you know, after a couple of single malts, it becomes maybe slightly less rational and more social. But we really enjoy each other, and the social side is really important. So the people I work with at the University of Miami, for example, it's very important to me that I have good relationships with them, not just so that I get quote unquote social support, but so that we have a sense of fellow feeling and camaraderie, and that we're working toward shared goals, which is something I'd like to talk about. In my family life, it's the same thing. We are very focused on how to be a good family and what it is we want to have our family be, and we have many conversations about that. Mostly we just live and enjoy. And I mentioned, if you want to be personal, I mentioned that I'm in Seattle because I'm here to visit my first grandchild. And she's beautiful and perfect. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here. It wasn't planned this way, but here I am. And with the miracle of technology, we can do this from Seattle as easily as Miami.
And our warm greetings to her and the rest of the family, of course, and thanking her as well for making you available during this precious time. And it brings something up. I think Manfred Kitz de Vries, one of the very renowned business executive coaches, psychologists, and scholars here in Europe, he is always saying that he is only doing 720-degree feedback exercises with the executives joining his programs, where 720 implies 360 feedback as usual during with the organization. The other 360 is with the family, because he believes that whatever kind of virtues or not we are living, it becomes very visible in the different constituencies that we're in. And I think that will be quite interesting as maybe one of the threads, because you are describing in your theory that some of the evolutionary devices that we have inherited, so to speak, are different based on what constituency we're in, on the family, on the group and tribe, on the, I think you call it the maxi tribe, or the very big groups and societies that we live in. So that will be very interesting, I reckon. I want to just briefly, in the usual fashion, frame the next hour and a half, and then Antoinette will start us off. So I will just share one more slide, as always, which is our basic structure that is so far very consistent during our sessions. We will start off with looking at what is good, what is a good society, and by linkage to that, what does it mean to be good in a business? Then we will try to look especially at how to operationalize goodness or ethics within an organizational structure, within a business especially. And finally, we will look at what it means to be good or become good as an individual, also to transform into better at a societal level. So from what is good, what is a good organization, to how do we drive change at individual or societal level. So that will hopefully keep us busy, and hopefully it will be interesting for everybody to follow. And Antoinette, do you want to start us off with the first section?
Of course, and I start very much in your comfort zone, Blaine, I would think. So as a professor, because it's almost a textbook question, but I find it always important to first explain the field. So what is philosophical psychology? Because I'm sure not a lot of people have already heard from that. And what different schools are distinguished in this psychology to explain the good?
Well, that's a really good question, of course, because philosophical psychology is not well known. And if I call myself that, in most cases, people have no idea what I mean. And even if I go among philosophical psychologists, they may, if they don't know me, they're not sure what I mean. It's not a very well-defined subfield of psychology. It's, I think, an important one, because what happened when psychology was founded over a century ago, it was split off from philosophy. All psychologists were originally philosophers. And it had to make itself as a distinct discipline. One of the ways it did that was to become as scientific as possible, and to differentiate itself from its roots. But part of what people did is they just left philosophy behind. They pretended that they didn't need it after a while. I mean, you had William James and some other people who were philosophers as well, but pretty soon psychologists became very distant from philosophy and acted as though they weren't doing any philosophy. But the truth is, every psychologist is doing philosophy in everything that they do. We just don't realize it usually, and we do it by fiat. So I think there's a lot of people who have come together to talk about those unasked questions and those unreflected on assumptions that are philosophical in nature, to try to help understand what it is we're doing as psychologists. So, but the troubling part for me about philosophical psychology is each scholar typically has his or her own favorite philosopher. And so we'll delve into that philosopher and talk about what that philosopher has to say about psychology. And in each case, it's interesting and valuable, but it doesn't tend to accumulate in that way. And of course, I'm as guilty as that as anyone, because my favorite philosopher is Aristotle. I read others as well, but that's who I talk about and write about the most. So I think that it's a pretty disparate field, and one that doesn't accumulate real well. I don't know if that's going to change or not. Partly it's a matter of being a small subgroup of people. Psychology is very large in the United States, and philosophical psychology is relatively small. So that's, hopefully that gets at what you were interested in.
So still, I'm kind of would like to know, for instance, there is critical psychology. And I know from critical psychologists, they always say most psychologists are slave to power. So is that something you had in mind when you said we need to be a little bit clearer about the values and normative assumptions we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I have learned an awful lot from critical theorists, particularly if you go to people like Habermas and Horkheimer and Hannah Arendt. They've been really influential to me. And sort of their postmodern variants and the neo-Nietzscheans who talk about power have been very influential. I think it's really useful to understand their points of view. I have a very good friend, Isaac Prelotensky, who teaches with me at the University of Miami, who's a critical psychologist. He's done this work for decades, looking at how it is that power influences decisions and actions, and in ways that people don't really recognize. So I think that discourse is extremely valuable. And Isaac's one of the rare critical psychologists who has a way of talking about this about the power issues that are positive, and he has some alternatives in mind.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems with philosophical psychology in general is that people do feel free to criticize and don't feel the requirement of creating alternatives. And it's a lot easier to criticize. So that's very understandable.
Yeah.
And for the first 15 years of my career, that's all I did. But in the last 20 years, I felt really the pull toward being able to say, well, what's the alternative if we're not going to fall victim to something like consumerism or an ideology like individualism or instrumentalism, or if we're not going to get sucked up and be an instrument of power, what would it mean to do it differently? And I think that's really important because particularly for people outside the academy, they're not very interested in critiques that don't lead anywhere. And a lot of them don't. And so I think it's really important. And that's, by the way, what took me to Aristotle, is I think he has some answers to some of these questions. And in partly because he just simply predates a lot of the questions. What bothers us and where we get caught up, we're just not issues for him. And I think in some ways, that's a very smart way to go.
Yeah, so I mean, we're now almost at, or I think I would like to go to where you took it, because you say, I looked for a constructive way. I tried to really bring these issues together, and I went back to Aristotle, and we have already touched it, but I think it's now the time to go deeper in that. You developed his natural ethics by tying on evolutionary psychology, on social psychology. And then that's difficult to explain that shortly, but I still would love you to kind of explain the reasoning behind, and maybe take an example, maybe take, for example, how you developed the that questions of justice come naturally to us. Maybe that's helpful for others to understand it.
Okay, well, you've given me a monumental task to say things in a short period of time as a professor, because I'm not very good at it, but let me give it a shot. I always tell my students when they ask a question, did you know you were going to get a professor's answer? And you want to ask any more questions? Because the answer is always much longer than the question. But so the way I came to Aristotle was, for those first 15 years, I was working closely with my mentor, Frank Richardson, on critiques of psychology. And we focused primarily on individualism. That is the idea that the individual is the basic unit of reality. And then also on instrumentalism, which is the belief that all human actions are means ends structured, that there's nothing other than that. So, and we produced a lot of critiques, and honestly, they became too easy because the targets are like fish in a barrel in psychology. That those assumptions are so widespread, and I can find them on any page of any journal or any book that you present to me. So we were able to show that those were unacknowledged value commitments that psychologists had, and psychologists have tried to eschew value commitments as far as possible, but we were able to find over and over again that those were present, and so people were not doing what they thought they were doing. So it's a kind of false consciousness from a critical theory point of view. That's a concept I learned from them. It's very valuable. So once we recognized that, and once we could show it over and over again, it stopped being interesting to continue to show it. It became interesting to ask, well, what would we do different from that? And I just happened to be reading for a small paper that I thought would be a one-off that was interesting on how do we overcome the idea of skills as the centerpiece of relationships. So communication skills being the key issue in all personal relationships. And so I thought, oh, you know, these skills, they kind of look like virtues. And what if I analyze the skills from a virtue perspective? What I came up with is the skills are really proto-virtues. And if we understand the virtues better, then we can do that rather than skills, because skills are a double-edged sword. I can use skills to enhance a relationship, or I can use skills to dominate in a relationship, right? So they're neutral for that. So I thought that was going to be one little paper, and that I published that in 2020, and for the last 20 years, or 2000, I'm sorry. And for the last 20 years, that's what I've been working on, because it just, it was an opening I couldn't resist, and it was so beautiful because, so here's what it is. So with the individualism part, Aristotle teaches that we are inherently social beings. And so we're built that way, we structured that way. What a lot of people don't realize is when they study Aristotle's Ethics, which is his main text that a lot of people in my field are interested in now, is that's just the introduction to the politics. The politics was the real deal for him. And the politics is about how a community comes together, organizes itself in a way that helps people to be good people and helps people to have good lives. And so this social part of him is not just that he used the word, he really meant it. And he did not believe. So, well, let me back up. Ancient Greek theorists in general believed that people were first and foremost members of a polis or community. And only secondarily could they be considered individuals. And without the polis, they were lost. Now we've lost that understanding. We have a very different structure of society now, so it's easy to see things quite differently. So that's one piece. And then on the instrumentalist side, he said, well, yeah, a lot of things we do are means ends structured, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But there are some things that aren't structured that way. And what I've called them, and what well, it's a term that fits with him, but I don't think he used, is constitutive activities, where the means and the ends are integrated in such a way they cannot be separated. So we think some simple examples of that are things like spending time with friends. How do you do that? By spending time with friends. What is your goal? To spend time with friends. Another thing I do, I have a hobby where I kayak. So people say, why do you kayak? Because I like kayaking. Where are you going? It doesn't matter. So I just want to be out on the water, and I want to be enjoying this natural world that's so beautiful. And I do that in a small boat that we paddle around, mostly Biscayne Bay, but many other places as well. So constitutive activities are then the alternative to instrumental activities, that there is an alternative. That structure doesn't explain all human action. There are a lot of things we do because we think that they're good things to do in and of themselves. And that's a really important thing about human beings. So that's the alternative now. The problem I ran into with Aristotle, he's great, but then he says that what we need to do is to fulfill our nature, fulfill human nature. And that's what it means to live a good life. Well, he has some ideas about that, but they're not satisfying for moderns because there's so many different versions of what it is to be a human, to the point where some people, particularly postmodernists, say there's no such thing as human nature because we can be all kinds of different things. We're so flexible and so dynamic that we can't really talk about an underlying nature. I don't think that's right. And so that's where I turn to evolutionary science, is if we're going to have a description of human nature that we can place faith in and believe is a good description, I think that's a very good place to start because it's scientifically based, and none of the other theories have that, or none of the other versions of human nature have that kind of scientific backing. And it's very powerful, very broad. Now, by the same token, it's not univocal. So there are lots of different versions of how humans evolved and lots of disagreement about that. What there isn't is disagreement about whether we evolved. Evolutionary scientists and scientists in general think that that's just a fact. It's not really a question anymore. The question is how exactly, and what exactly does that mean? And so I think there's a lot of room still for debate and discussion. It's not something that's settled and finished. But then again, I think that's part of what we evolved to be, is the kind of creatures who have these ongoing debates and discussions about what it means to be human. And that's a way in which I diverge from most evolutionary scientists, is I think that what's most true of us is exactly that, is that we have ongoing conversations about what it is to be a human being, about what it is to live a good life. And that I don't think those questions will ever be finally answered, because I think things will continue to change and evolve as we go forward. And that's a little different. That open-endedness is not something you hear very much from evolutionary psychology or evolutionary scientists. We tend to look backwards at how we got to where we are, and we don't tend to think about where we are and what that means for the future. But I think that's really important.
Well, if I'm correct, you also try to kind of read it in a different way, because you really try to show it's not only about enlightened self-interest, it's not only instrumental. So probably going back to the constitutive activities for one thing. And the other thing is, as you say, there are questions. So, I mean, the questions are coming up. There are some things which kind of we cultivated to a certain degree, but it doesn't mean that we now know, for instance, we need justice and then we know how to do justice. Question what type of justice is correct in a certain situation. And there, of course, you're already leaping quite from evolutionary psychology, I would imagine so.
Can I can I come in there for 1 second? Because I think, Blaine, so one, I would like to make publicity for the evolution of ethics, which is one of the many pieces you've written, but I would say probably, at least from my perspective, a very masterpiece in doing what Antoinette suggested, bringing evolutionary theory and ethics together. And before we go to the question of justice, Antoinette, I just wanted to frame briefly the inquiry, because people who haven't read the book, Blaine, I think will find it maybe difficult to jump. So just one more question on the book. So basically, the way you explained it, so Aristotle is suggesting that we should become excellent in doing those activities that make us truly human. So the functional argument that he suggests. So basically, you have said, okay, that's great, but what is it that is truly human? The best way to go there with evidence was evolutionary theory, which looks at what is human vis-a-vis what is not human. For example, what is it that the monkeys did, or what any other species prior to the evolution, the development of humans did. And you look very specifically at some of the, as you call it, adaptations that supported human fitness in regards to their increasing propensity of survival, so to speak, in the respective environments within which humans evolved. Now, I would like to ask you, if possible, and I'm happy to give some of my notes into the middle just to ensure that we're covering all the points. But what did you find out? So what were the most important aspects of humankind that support the functional argument? And then maybe, where does justice, as Antoinette wanted to go to justice, where does justice come in that context? But my first question is, what did you find out from looking at evolution?
First thing I found out is that Aristotle and evolutionary science are remarkably compatible. You wouldn't think so, because he didn't have any idea about really evolution, but what he said lends itself to that very well. And then what I find is that a lot of evidence and theorizing from evolutionary science fills out things he didn't say. So there's a lot of amending and updating of Aristotle we need to do. And I should just give a quick caveat about that, because he said a lot of things that we find repulsive, or not a lot of things, but a few things about women being second-class citizens, or about some people being natural slaves. Well, we don't believe that way anymore, but I think we can dispense with those ideas without any real loss to his philosophy. They were just kind of, in a way, him being a creature of his time. So let me come back to your question then, Otti, because I think it's a great one. So first thing I found is that Aristotle and evolutionary science are quite compatible. Second thing I found is that we can talk in detail about human nature. So it isn't just one big glob of something. There are some very clear details, and that's what evolutionary science teaches you, is that our species evolved in steps. It wasn't all at once. We didn't all of a sudden become all at once humans. There were a lot of steps. There were a lot of branches of the human family, and Homo sapiens, as we know them, as we know ourselves, is just one of those options. And it turned out to be the one that lasted. So what are some of those things? Well, one of those things is that human beings have a propensity toward attachment, is that we make specific relationships with specific people that are extremely important to our well-being. So, in one way you think about, well, yeah, babies need that because babies are incredibly incapable. They're totally reliant, totally dependent on their caregivers. And it takes a long time before that changes. And so an attachment relationship is a way to ensure that they get the care and nurturance that they need. Well, along the way, attachment isn't just a mechanism. Attachment involves people and includes, in the best cases, love. And loving attention is what helps babies to flourish. When they don't get that, they don't flourish, they languish. So there you see something more than this kind of mechanistic causal thing happening. And you notice that parents give quite a lot. Now, well, that works in evolutionary theory because the success of our offspring is our success in evolution, right? So if our children grow up to have children, we've succeeded. We're still in the gene pool. If they don't, then we're not in the gene pool anymore, and we might succeed in other ways, and those successes might be wonderful. But from an evolutionary perspective, successful reproduction is the bar. That's what makes a difference between what gets adapted and what doesn't get adapted. So, well, what happens with that is among human beings then, it isn't just babies that get attached. Adults are attached too. We're attached to friends. We're attached to romantic partners. And those attachments are really important to us. Now, we can talk about the specific instrumental benefits of those attachments, like we get supported, we get loved, we're able to reproduce with a mate, say, those are all good things, but that's not all there is to it for us. The attachments are much stronger and much richer than that. And so this richness, I think, is the part of the evolution that sometimes gets left off. And if you just think,
I think if I can, Blaine, there's also another aspect, because what I think you do very precisely in your book is you explain the logic for the adaptation. So attachment was necessary because it was the altricity that was a consequence of us developing so much independence in the learning facilities and the big brains that humans developed. Therefore, they had longer periods of being dependent. Therefore, evolution almost had to invent attachment. And then in another instance, you explain how attachment gets adapted to situations where otherwise intergroup conflict could become problematic. So I think what is really compelling is that you show how truly human characteristics are a result of evolution, but then you're making the argument that they become constitutive, not just a means-end production of the most fit individual species on the planet, so to speak. Right? And what would you suggest in hindsight are the most important aspects that make humans truly human?
well, this is one of them, because all mammals have attachment systems. That's part of mammalian reproduction. But what happened with humans is that attachment became elongated. And then the term that's sometimes used among evolutionists is it became exapted. That is, the same mechanisms got put to use for friendships and mating relationships that were helpful for raising young children. So we develop these strong attachments to other people. And then what happens is we come to love each other. And see, that term love is not just a mechanism. So you can think of it as an evolutionary mechanism that compels people to do certain things, or you can think of it as something that draws people into a relationship and draws people into caring about another person, to where in our important relationships, what you notice really quickly is that people will do things whether or not it benefits them. And it's not just that they're being fooled into doing them. I think that people come to value those loved ones as much as they value themselves. And those relationships come to shape our lives in a way that goes well beyond benefits, giving and taking. It's that we become all in these relationships. And that's a kind of a constitutive approach to the relationship. I'm not looking for what I'm going to get out of it. That's one way we look at relationships. But another way we look at them is that I'm committed to this. This is part of my life. This person is someone I want to take care of and be part of their lives, and I want to see them flourish and do well, whether or not it benefits me. And if they flourish and do well, it will benefit me, but that's not why I do it. I do it because I value them. And so I think that's a switch that became made in us becoming human as we became capable of that. I could do the same thing with the idea of justice. So one of the characteristics of human beings is that we are immensely cooperative. And people are a little surprised by this, but we are the most cooperative beings on the planet, maybe in the universe. And people say, oh, but wait a minute, oh, these people, they're not very cooperative, they're self-serving, they weren't considerate of me and so forth. And yes, that does happen. But what you have to notice with that is how quickly we come up with those things, and that we're vigilant about the absence of cooperation. We care about whether people are cooperative with us or not, and we react very negatively when they're not. So in other words, we expect people to be cooperative. Well, in today's society, that's not going to happen a lot of times because we're anonymous figures to everybody. But if you look back at hunter-gatherer societies, cooperation is endemic. It's what they do all the time. And people who are not cooperative get feedback and pressure, and maybe even expulsion if they can't do it. So cooperation is huge. Well, how does that translate? Because you could think of cooperation simply as I give you something, so you give me something. So again, an exchange, means ends kind of relationship. And that's a big part of cooperation. We do it all the time. But we also become invested in creating a cooperative environment. So it's not good enough that I can cooperate with Antoinette and I don't care about Otti. If we are going to be in a group together and trying to survive together, then what I care about is that we, all three of us, can take cooperation for granted. We can operate on the assumption that each of us is trustworthy. And what that does is that removes a tremendous amount of friction from cooperation. It removes the need to be vigilant. It removes the need to give feedback or punishment or anything else to non-cooperation, because we're assuming the cooperation. And when we assume it, it's just easier to do. And so we do this with each other as a matter of course. And then all of a sudden it becomes a norm. And now that it's a norm, we believe it's valuable in and of itself. So we will do things to defend the cooperative environment as much as we will to make sure we get what's due to us. And that's exactly what you see in hunter-gatherer societies. So guess what we have now? If we are invested in this cooperative environment, what's necessary? We need to be trustworthy to each other. And if we're trustworthy, it means we do what we say and we treat each other fairly. So in just a few short steps, we're all the way from cooperation as an adaptation to justice as a social norm and as something important. Now, what Antoinette pointed out is that we mean a lot of different things by justice. And even in my environment, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So justice is not something that's simple. It's complex, has many facets. We disagree about how they should be ranked and how they should be understood. Well, that doesn't mean we don't care about justice. It just means, it actually means we care a lot about it. We spend a lot of time differentiating all these things, talking about them, arguing about them, working out systems that we think will help promote justice. So I think the disagreement actually makes the case for it being extremely important rather than undermining that case.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of show that by this, you also kind of bridging another disagreement, in my opinion. If you look at some of the studies you're citing, for instance, the studies of behavioral economists, they would never kind of really say, well, it's in a sense also cultivated, because preference are still kind of, you know, kept. But we do have some homo reciprocans, and they make sure in the end that we have the right mixture. That's there. And you now, of course, taking it many steps further. And I think the last point is a very interesting one, that we really are talking about it. And you can see that even with children. How would we have to enact fairness in certain environments? I think that's a really good case. But, and that's why I was so keen on justice, because here I really started to realize what all other virtue theorists were also telling us. We cannot give a list. Now, we have fairness is important, and fairness is also then a domain for virtues. Let's maybe put it this way. But then how can we agree, or do we have to agree? Are we then in the end kind of using dialogic ethics to make sure that we are, you know, going towards the right fairness? Is this something I'm going to deliberate myself with practical wisdom? How can I know in what situation, what type of fairness is needed? Because I mean, this is of course in the end what it's all about.
Well, I think that's a very hard question. It's one that, again, we're just going to debate about into the indefinable future. But we want to try to get the terms of the debate in the best way we can now and try to answer the needs of justice in the best way we can as well. I mean, the truth is, if you look around the world and if you look through history, there have been very different versions of justice. And the way we're seeing it now in North Atlantic civilizations is quite different than what you see in other civilizations of this time. And if you go back to our ancestors in these North Atlantic civilizations, things look quite different. So one answer to that is say, oh, well, then it's many different things and we can't really boil it down to one thing. And that's partly true, but I don't think it's where we should stop. So how do we know what's good? Well, I think there are a lot of ways. One is we can look at if we start to look at how well people do in various systems, in various communal organizations, that gives us a clue about how the justice is working. So if there are some people going hungry and other people have plenty, and the people who are going hungry are suffering and languishing, it's pretty clear that's not very just. If, on the other hand, we have a society that meets the basic needs of its people, so that people have things that everyone needs, like clean air, clean water, food, a place to live, then that society is, I think, clearly going to be judged as more just. Now, of course, if you don't value the good of the many, then you would say that doesn't matter. But so I'm assuming the good of the many being a value that people hold. And in my country, the United States, not everyone holds that value, I can tell you. That's very clear. So again, it's a discussion about what is it we value, what is it we think is good. And there's a case to be made that making certain things available to everyone is important for justice. There's another case to be made that merit should be acknowledged. And that's a different kind of case than the case of equality, where we think that certain things are due to everyone. And we have a lot of different ideas about justice where we can debate back and forth. But I think part of the thing is figuring out what sort of situation we are facing. Which form of justice is going to be the one that's going to help us here? And that gets back to that idea of practical wisdom that you mentioned. And from an Aristotelian point of view, we can never have a rule book for life. That it's just not algorithmic. We can't boil it down to a set of ideas that are good, and we just have to figure out how to apply them in each case. Aristotle was very big on focusing on the particulars of a situation and understanding that in view of what we think is worthwhile overall, and then how do we bring that worthwhileness into being in this current situation. So if we're dealing with a situation where it's a universal need, that's one thing. If we're dealing with a situation where only certain people demonstrate the highest level of excellence, so let's say we're looking at the Olympics, who gets the gold medal, who gets the silver, who gets the bronze, and none of the people in the Olympics are not talented. They're all extremely talented. So it's a question of which talent do we acknowledge? That's a different question than who gets medical care, who gets food. Very different questions. And so having the wisdom to recognize what it is we're struggling with will help to guide us in understanding the answers best. Now, of course, those things change as well. Circumstances change, our thinking changes, we interact with different cultural groups who have different norms, and we come to see our own in a different light. So these are, that's why I think that they're open questions. They're not things that we ever solve finally.
But what you did develop now, if I understood you correctly, you looked at the hierarchy of goods. So you instrumental, constitutive, but certainly also the common good, I think so. That was one of the main things you draw upon. So that's one thing. I also read, and I just want to go back to that because I was very amazed when we talked to Alejo Cizon that he would also come up with this dialogue. So, because that's another thing. Can you, in the end, also mix these different ethics? Because, I mean, having a dialogical ethics is kind of a, you know, foreign concept in an Aristotelian version. I would think so. I don't know. So that's another thing I'd be interested. Makes, of course, a lot of sense, because especially fairness is something which is not only in the context, but it also has to do with other human beings in that context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it depends, of course, what you mean by dialogical ethics. And if you start that discussion with the idea that it's all just social construction, which some people do, then you can't get to the place where I want to get to, because that kind of rules that out from the beginning. If, on the other hand, you say, well, we're trying to get things right, and one way to get things right is to have back and forth conversation about it, and to take different cases and to look at different perspectives, then I think you can start to talk about one way of thinking or acting might be better than another way of thinking or acting. And so it's that incremental improvement that I think dialogical ethics can help us with. Now, I may be misusing that term because it's not a term I typically use. One of the interesting things about Aristotle is he did not think he had the last word about ethics. So we sometimes think he has a system and that's it. And when he was done, he could close the book and everybody should just do what Aristotle said. But that's not how he saw it. He believes he was making an initial approximation that would get batted around in the future if things went well for him. And as it turns out, here we are 2,300 years later, still talking about him. So things went quite well. Now, there have been times when he was not much of not a very important figure. But currently he really is. And that's part of the zeitgeist I referred to earlier, is that a lot of people are going back to his writings and thinking that he has things to tell us. And that's part of that openness to the other, that dialogical view, is that there are many perspectives from which we can learn. And so it's important to be open to that learning and to see what people have to say to us, whether it's Aristotle or Lao Tzu or Confucius or whoever. There are a lot of different smart folks who have lived in the world, and they have a lot to teach us. So it's a good idea to listen.
But I think there is a challenge in the open-endedness that you mentioned. So I'm trying to frame in my mind where we have gotten to in this first section about what good is. And I think what we're saying, or what you're writing, is Aristotle suggests good is at which all things aim. Good is what is the end outcome, and then actually outcome is the wrong word. Good is what we aim for, and it's actually the activity. So you describe eudaimonia as a constitutive activity, as an integration of all those human goods that are necessary to make us flourish. And I think in the evolutionary theory, you derive a number of aspects, especially focusing on what you call the ultra-social nature of human beings. And I think the key goods beyond justice that you frame are friendship, identity, knowledge, belonging, shared identity, status, and social order. And I think we don't have the scope to go into all of these aspects, but I think in the last section, I certainly would love to have a look at identity and shared identity again, because again, this is where some of the psychological insights and the philosophical insights, I think, match. But so good is what we aim for. It's an activity, it's coming through the character that we develop. It's about understanding who we are as humans and trying to bring that into our day-to-day life. Whereas it doesn't give us precise answers, as Antoinette pointed out, with regards to what decision, what type of fairness, justice to implement in a specific moment. And I guess that to a degree is unsatisfactory, isn't it? Because you're closing very much in your book with this notion that we are predestined to create societies, but there's nothing which prescribes what type of society humans would create. But like you say, some are better than others, right? So we need to find a way to frame a good society probably beyond being human in the way that you define it.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say that if I had 100,000 readers who read my book as well as you did, I would feel like I had died and gone to heaven. So you really got it. So I really appreciate that. It's wonderful. Yeah, I think where we have to start is what's good for us as the kind of creatures we are. And so that's where the things that I outline in the book. And then we realize that there are different ways to get there, that there isn't just one way to get there. So if we think it's good to love and be loved, to have friendships and close attachments, there are lots of different forms of those. If we think that having a cooperative group and a group to which we feel strong belonging is really important to us, again, there are a lot of different ways to get to that. And so the first thing we need to do, though, I think, is take this idea of the good very, very seriously. Because it's not just what sounds good to us or what seems good to us, although that we will work on that most of the time because we mostly make our decisions and choose our actions pretty spontaneously and without really deliberating about it. But we do also need to deliberate about it. So when we're shaping our societies, or when things are not going well, either at an interpersonal level or at a systemic level, we need to be able to step back and do that deliberation and reflection. And so that's where the self-reflection and the wisdom become really important, because we realize that we thought we were setting up one thing and it didn't go the way we thought it would. And so we need to rethink it. And so what do we do differently that can get us more to the ideals we espouse?
It's really about reflection to a degree. And I think, Antoinette, you always say reflection in and about action. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing, it requires agency. Mm-hmm. And we talked with Bill Torbert about action inquiry, the ability to reflect whilst we're acting about what the right action is. And that really resonates, I think, with what you say. So that ability becomes important. Mm-hmm. I reckon something else that you say, and I think comes through in the way that you express things, is care. So this caring for, and I guess for the immediate others, for the wider others, and then for the species as a whole, this notion of caring is probably another core aspect that when you say we need to take good seriously in considering what we do becomes prevalent, right? So this notion of caring is in our DNA to a degree, but it might get forgotten, so to speak, in the heat of the action very often in our today's society.
It can, yes. And the caring has, I think there are two different ways that are really important that we care. One is we care about the other people we're attached to, and that's part of that attachment. Or we care about the people in the group. That's part of what it means to belong to a group. And these are really strong, well-researched, well-documented findings about human beings, is that we do have that caring. But we also care about doing things in the best possible way. And so the term that I use in the book is ethical mindedness, is that we want to try to figure out what is the best way to do these things. Can we feel comfortable about it? Can we justify it? Can we think that this is leading us to a good future? These are things that I think are just built into human beings. And so I asked a question at the conference I was at last week on this, is that someone said, well, where's the parental authority? That was a great question. But then I thought there's a bigger question, which is, where's the authority at all? Why do we care? Why aren't we just out there trying to get everything we can for ourselves individually all the time? And, you know, the devil take the hindmost. That is not how we do things. I mean, there are people who do it that way, and we occasionally find ourselves in that mode. But for the most part, we really care about having what I've called this cooperative environment, or we could talk about it as social harmony. We could talk about it as social cohesion. We could talk about it as the welfare of the group, the common good of the group. These are things that really matter to us. And when they're going badly, we suffer as a result of them going badly. So one of the most compelling studies of that is well, there's a lot of compelling studies about it, but what you find is that if social harmony is not, if you live in a situation with social disharmony, it's harmful to the individual. And so it's not something that's irrelevant to us. Maybe I live in a situation of social disharmony and I'm doing quite well. Well, it still harms me. It still reduces my ability to flourish as a person. Now, if I'm in that same disharmonious situation and the disharmony is harming me as well as, I mean, directly harming me, as well as being a problem for me just due to disharmony, that's even worse, of course. So what you'll see in human groups is you'll see typically long periods of harmony and maintenance of tradition and people doing things a certain way and agreeing that that's the way to do it. And then you'll see some innovation crop up. Somebody will come up with what they think is a better way to do things. And during the period of adoption of that better way, there'll be a fair amount of disharmony and disjunction and difficulty. And then if things go well, this new innovation really is a good idea, people adopt it and a new kind of harmony emerges. And what we have to hope for and work for is that we're getting incrementally better with these innovations. And so we understand a little bit better how to do things. We understand a little bit better how to take care of each other. We understand a little bit better about ourselves and what it means to live really well. So that's where taking the good seriously really comes in. Sort of the rubber meets the road, is that I think we do care about that very much. And again, it's not everybody. So when I talk about human beings being cooperative and ethically minded and caring about the group, that's most of us. And there are a few who just want to get whatever they can. And so I think we have to be watching out for them, because they'll take advantage of anything that we set up that's good for people in general to get the most for themselves. So it's not as though we're all the same, and that everyone is intimately and innately and dispositionally cooperative. It's not quite the case. There's some really interesting evolutionary studies of this where if you take, they do game theoretic studies, and the game theoretic studies are such that you specify what kind of beings are in your study, and they're not real beings, they're just kind of counters or instances. It's a simulation study, and they'll say, oh, let's make them all self-centered. They only respond to self-interest. And let's see what happens if we introduce some cooperative individuals at a very small rate to this group. What happens is you reach an equilibrium in these studies of around 70% of the beings in this study become cooperative and respond to cooperation, and about 30% don't. And so it isn't that cooperation takes over and completely dominates, but there's the equilibrium of cooperators and exploiters. But it's the majority that does the cooperating. So it's important to understand that, so that we don't take for granted or believe without reflection that everyone is cooperative, because that's not the case. And that corrects what I said before, because I don't want people to think that I'm that Pollyannish, because I've seen plenty of non-cooperators in action, as we all have.
Hold that thought, because we're certainly going to talk about how could you enable a cooperative environment if you take an organization to be one. And we'll also kind of have to deal with the bad apples then. So that's we really want to dive into. And another thing comes to my mind is, of course, also the framing. You probably know this difference between the Wall Street game and the community game. And people cooperated much more in the community game just because it was called community game. So I think your aspirational idea of transformation comes in there. Let's call it a community game and not a Wall Street game, if I read your book and your writings correctly.
I think that would help, yes. I don't think that's the whole ball game, because you have to ask yourself, why does calling it community help? And I think the reason is that most people have a strong motivation toward the communal. And if you put people in a situation where incentives are the thing that matters, the only thing that matters, like the Wall Street game, or a lot of the research that psychologists do, then they will respond to the incentives.
Although the funny thing is the incentives were exactly the same. And just because, so I mean, still, but I mean, this is getting probably too nerdy a little bit if we're going too deep in there. And I have one more nerdy question before we go into the broader topics again, which we have been already at. What I struggle most with, first I have to tell everybody who's looking that we're not going to look at how to operationalize virtues, I would suggest, because you can read his excellent paper, Strive For. That's a new paper, and we cited that already. But what I am really struggling with is that we don't, and it of course is also very difficult, but we don't have a good measure for eudaimonia, which of course will be difficult. But if you had to measure it, if you can come up with your own measure, how would you go about it?
Every meeting of scholars of flourishing I go to struggles with this question. So we haven't figured it out yet. I can tell you that for sure. First, let me just mention what I mean by eudaimonia and what I interpret Aristotle to have meant, because not everybody's familiar with that term, and it breaks down into three things. One is eu, which is good, so as in euphoria or eupraxia, and then the daimon was a Greek concept of that. The closest thing in our language is something like a guardian angel. Or it could also be considered fate, one's fate. So in other words, there's something outside of us that's guiding us in some direction, and that's trying to help us get to that goal. And then the ia means that it's a way of life. So Aristotle used a synonym makarios for that, and he used them interchangeably throughout the Ethics. Makarios means blessed, and you can think of that as divinely blessed, or you can think of that as just good fortune, being a fortunate person. And the Greeks were very good at understanding the importance of fortune, which I consider myself extremely fortunate, that there's so many things that I didn't earn that are available to me. They just happen to be there, and I'm very happy about that. Okay, so coming back to that, how might we try to measure this? How might we try to assess eudaimonia? It's hard because what Aristotle and most people who use that term mean is something that's global. It's a good life. It's the idea of flourishing. So living in the best way that a human being can live. Those are all we can do, I think, in the end is arrive at good indicators of that. I don't think we ever measure the concept itself, but we can find a lot of indicators. Now, unfortunately, the indicators that most people have used most of the time have been self-report scales. And I say unfortunate because that's just a limitation. I don't say that it's a bad way to measure it, because in some ways, who's a better reporter on whether I'm flourishing than me? Well, maybe people around me might be able to be better reporters if I'm very deceived or very self-interested or self-focused or something. But that's so self-report is the main way we've done it. And so we ask people to agree or disagree with statements. How true are they of you, or how much do you agree with this statement about yourself? And that gives us some information. We could also, as I've already intimated, ask people in their lives, what do you think about this individual's flourishing? So getting other reports. And so what would my wife say about my flourishing? What would my coworker say about my flourishing? And they might notice some things that I don't, or that I maybe minimize. And they say, well, he's not flourishing because, gosh, you know, he gets kind of impatient and he wants things to happen faster than they possibly can. So how could that be flourishing? So that's another source we can get from other reports. And we can also do physiological measurement. We can look at how people are doing in their health, in their vitality. There was one really interesting study where people looked at which stress indicators were turned on in various people and which ones weren't. And in this study, they found that people who self-reported greater eudaimonia, the stress markers in their cells were turned off. And the people who emphasized hedonia, that is positive affect and satisfaction, the stress markers were turned on. So that's a physiological measure that I think we should continue to pursue. There's a lot of different ones that we can do. Cortisol is the most common, but I think that's a way to go. I think we also need to look at flourishing as a more communal experience or activity. That to what degree are people feeling a part of something larger than themselves, and how can we see that in ways that go beyond what they believe? Because one of the things about belonging is I can believe I belong to a group, and if you ask the other people in the group, they say, he doesn't belong, he's not one of us, he's a faker, he's a wannabe. Belonging is one of those things that's inherently shared, in that whatever I think about my belonging, I could be right or wrong about that. And the only way it's clearly confirmed is if other people treat me as a member of the group. if other people welcome me and acknowledge me as a member of the group. Then if I've got it both internally and externally, then I've got that experience of belonging. Now I could be a member of the group in everyone else's eyes and disbelieve it about myself, then I don't feel like I belong, and I start to feel isolated and lonely, even when that's not true. So we can go wrong in a lot of ways. Our perceptions are not are far from perfect, and so that's one of the problems with any self-report measure, is that we can just get it wrong because we don't see things quite right. Either we see them as too rosy or we see them as too negative, and it can go either way.
And if
So we need more than self-report, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, that was just perfectly developed. And I think we need to move further. Otherwise, Otti's getting a little bit impatient with my nerdy questions. But I was just kind of thinking, what I find most challenging is the integrity part and the whole life part. I mean, what you were saying, this is kind of what we have often in psychology. But how on earth can I really measure integrity in that sense? And the whole life? Would I have to ask people on their deathbed in addition? Or, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking we might need to get a little bit more creative as well. Did I know? I mean.
Well, I think one of the good ways of doing what you're talking about, I mean, I actually think asking people late in life about whether they would endorse their life and whether they would, to what degree would they change things that they did, would be a fascinating way to get at this. Another way to get at it would be to do narrative interviews oriented toward flourishing, because then you get people talking about the different parts of their lives and where they felt like it was going well and where it wasn't, and what the elements of that going well was. I think that would be a great kind of study to do. So it's a whole different form of data. Mostly what I've talked about so far was quantitative data, but this would be more qualitative data that could inform this in a very rich way. And I've got lots of stories for you about that, but we probably don't have time for my stories.
but I think, well, the stories would be lovely, but I think indeed it might be worthwhile on this one, given you've got the network of researchers, to maybe even follow up, I was thinking, Antoinette, because this is one of our core questions. We will analyze a whole bunch of existing ratings and rankings and studies, from happiness studies to ethical rankings and so on. And maybe we can discuss a little bit further, because I was intrigued by your notion of objective list, because in reality, if I look at what Bill Tobert talked about, and to a degree also Carol Sanford, is that people develop, and of course, if you believe in developmental psychology, but they would develop through their life to different mindsets and paradigms. And I think we come to that in the individual transformation in a short while. But I guess how people evaluate their lives will change based on kind of what stage of maturity they are actually in. And that might be if I'm an achiever, as Bill Tobert would call it, someone who's focused on achieving success in the way that it's conditioned by the society around me, and very often materialistic terms, then I might have a completely different view of whether my life is good or not than when I evolve into a more mature or a different stage in my life. And your objective list, to a degree, might help there to say, okay, let's go through some of the items that are objectively human, right, in terms of eudaimonia, and to what degree, like you say, are you in good friendship with others? Are you contributing to a greater purpose than yourself, etc.? And maybe then we could evaluate some of the self responses that you see on measures like self-reported well-being, which are probably not quite consistent. And I think, Antoinette, we've just seen a study that was suggesting happiness indicators across countries are not really comparable because of the different cultural conditioning and the way that people evaluate very different things when they say I'm happy. But again, I think it's a follow-up question. Certainly, it's a hard nut, I think. So let's go to the second section, maybe, which was about how do we operationalize this. So we've talked a little bit about what is good, what is human, what does evolutionary theory tell us. Very interesting, the kind of eudaimonia, the being blessed, being guided by a good spirit almost, in the way that we find fortune in our lives, sometimes well self-deserved, sometimes not. So how can organizations, in a wider sense, play a role in creating an environment where people flourish. And again, Antoinette, I'll ask you to frame the first questions maybe, and then let's see where we go from there.
Yeah, maybe we take it as we have come to see companies, because we find it quite intriguing to follow the idea that there are intermediate associations. So half of a polis in a polis. Now, this is the very layman's turn to put it. And it just came across me, if this is how we frame organization, then your concept of civic friendship would probably be a helpful one. And of course, I would like you to explain it, but I would also like you to tell us, what would this organization have to cater for in order for the civic friendship to be more likely to be developed?
Okay, yeah. Now, the first thing I have to say is that I'm not an organizational psychologist, so I'm afraid that what I'll say might be a little bit simple, and maybe people already know it. But in some ways, even if that's the case, I think there are things that are worth reiterating and underlining, even if we already know them. And so I would again go back to this idea of the good being people are drawn towards certain good things, like friendships and like justice and like social harmony, and that our organizations should help us with those things. Because I completely agree with you. I think that businesses are really important to contemporary life in a way that they weren't if we go back even a few hundred years, let alone a few thousand years. So it's become a major structural part of our world, particularly in North Atlantic societies, but elsewhere as well. And so if these organizations are oriented only toward outcomes such as profit, then I think we've got some serious problems, because they're going to treat people as means to the end of that profit. They're going to treat the environment as means to the end of that profit. They're going to treat their local governments as means to the end of that outcome. So we need a different way to think about it. And civic friendship is a very good one. And so if we take the idea of the good seriously, and if we believe that businesses have a role to play in the human good, which I think that they do, then we want to think about how can businesses be structured and oriented so that they do promote those goods, so that they aren't kind of nearsightedly focused only on profit outcomes. Now, of course, people need to make money. We need to have our economy needs to run. So I'm not saying that money and outcomes are unimportant, but I'm saying they can't be the sole driver of what we do. And we see lots and lots of examples of how that can actually work, that some businesses make fantastic profits, but then they also need to focus on other things besides profits. So what might some of that be? Well, some of that would be that I think it's extremely important for people in organizations to believe that they're part of the organization, that they matter in the organization. And I mentioned my friend Isaac Polotensky. He's written about this, and he talks about mattering in organizations as one of the key things for the success of both the individual and the organization. So that we have a role to play, that we can buy into what it is this organization is about, that we think it's a worthwhile goal. And there are plenty of worthwhile goals that are also quite profitable. So these things aren't totally incompatible. But that we need to keep in mind that what is the mission? What is it we're trying to accomplish with this organization, whether it's a business or a university or a nonprofit organization? And is it something that the people within it find valuable, find worthwhile? And do they think that they can contribute to that? And that they have a valuable role to play in that? I think those are all things that are really important. And this goes to both the social and the rational side of human being, is that we want to belong, and we want to belong to something we think is meaningful. We want to believe that we're serving a purpose. We're not just going through the motions and getting some some money along the way in terms of salary or wages, but that what we're doing is really worthwhile. So those are some things. And then another part of it would be, I think we want to try to cultivate what Aristotle called koinonia, which has been incorporated in a lot of Christian traditions as communion or fellow feeling. But he came first. He used the word first, and he was referring to that first. And so I think it's valuable anywhere we find it, of course, and that, do we care about the people around us? Is participation in the organization all about sharp elbows? Or is it about working together toward common aims that we think are worthwhile? And do we celebrate one another's accomplishments, or do we feel just envy and so forth? And I think the way the organization is structured, and leaders can do a lot about creating the right kind of ethos so that people can feel that they belong and that their contributions are valued and that they're doing something that's worthwhile in the world. And I think that's one of the things about leadership that I find most important, is, does a leader help me to understand that what we're doing is truly worthwhile? In other words, can I love it? Can I love the outcome? And I keep coming back to that word because I think it's so important. Because I think what love does is it draws us into things, but whether it's an ideal or a person, and it makes that thing valuable in and of itself. And I think that's what good leaders need to do, help us to love what we're up to.
And it brings up John King, who wrote Tribal Leadership, and he was hosting a session where he suggested that we need to listen others into existence. So almost this notion of honoring their presence, making them become alive because of the relationship that is being installed. And I think Simon Weston in the previous session talked about re-enchanting our lives. And I feel some of that coming through in what you say. I wanted to go the rational route for a second, because what I took from, you have, of course, deliberately, and someone clearly accused you of cherry picking, focused on the social aspects of evolutionary theory in your work. But I'm wondering, if we take McIntyre's Virtues, Practices, Institution framework, where clearly he is developing the moral aspects of the practice and sometimes the corrupting aspect of the institution. And we're taking from your work a predisposition of people to collaborate, but also I think, and I found this part very interesting when you talk about war and when you talk about domination vis-a-vis a new way to hierarchy in humankind, which is about prestige and the role of authentic versus hubristic pride. So I'm almost wondering, is there not a correlation? Is there not the institution of the organization offering opportunities, one, for that communion that you describe, which is fellowship and the love for being together in something important, but there's also room for the practice that I engage in through my work with pride, because I'm developing mastery in something that is relevant in the context, and only becomes relevant in the context of the communion that I am in. So there's almost like, I can see, if you take your hierarchy of goods, there are probably internal goods that I produce individual through my work. There are profit and other goods that the organization produces as a whole. Then there are internal goods that are produced by the organization, as McIntyre would suggest, through the practices. And then there's probably contribution to the wider society in the way that the organization acts within the ecosystem. So you could almost extend your theory of instrumental goods and then constitutive goods at the different levels in relation to the community vis-a-vis the individual practice in the context of an organization. So maybe a little bit complicated, but I thought if maybe we can combine McIntyre's framework with your thinking to give also room for the individual activity in the context of the community. Does anything come up? Does that sound?
Yeah, the first thing is somewhat of a feeling of chagrin. I haven't mentioned him already because I learned a lot from McIntyre.
There you go.
In fact, he's where I first came across the ideas that I call constitutive and shared goods, particularly the constitutive side. Now he calls them internal and external goods. So I used that terminology in one of my early books, and people said, "Oh, everybody's going to be confused by that because they're going to think it's internal to the person or external to the person." That's not what he meant at all. So he meant internal to the practice, or
I
internal.
actually made a note of that when I was reading your book. I'm glad that you point to it. And I thought,
Yeah,
is it the same
so,
question mark? Very good.
So I changed the terminology so that it's more descriptive. So constitutive and shared goods is more descriptive than the internal external thing. And it helps to keep the two sets of goods separate as well. I mean, MacIntyre is an interesting character, and I think it's really important to remember that he was or is still drawing on Aristotle, but going his own way. And what he writes is not strictly Aristotelian. I mean, there is no strict Aristotelian, of course, but he's really a MacIntyrean. And so part of what he says is, I mean, I think it's very valuable stuff, but I'm a little leery of his notion that, say, virtues are inherent to practices, for example, and that institutions tend to be corrupting. I think it's taking a line that I'm not really that willing to go into.
Agreed. And
so
many would agree with you on that one for sure.
he might at this point, who knows? I think he was trying to salvage virtue ethics in a way that was in a very unique and creative way, when there wasn't much salvaging of it. So all the credit goes to him in that. I mean, I read his book after Virtue when it came out, and it rocked my world. I mean, it was so compelling and so powerful. But basically, I mean, one way to interpret that whole book in a sentence is, we need to go back and learn what Aristotle thought, because we've really messed it up since then.
But I think there was he became a Marxist to a degree. There was a recognition that institutions in both capitalism and communism, to a degree, had brought upon bad things, so to speak. So I think his I don't know at all, but his skepticism towards the institution, I think, was also based on that historical analysis to a degree.
Right. And I think when he wrote that book is in the 1970s.
I think you would have a psychological if you would want to look at, as I call it sometimes, thwarting, you could then weave in, I know you're critical, but in that case, you could weave in self-determination theory, because of course that would show that sometimes you might be crowding out some aspects of the constitutive goods. And I mean, you have been careful saying it's not intrinsic motivation, but it's the practice. I understood that, but still that's maybe a link we could be drawing. I don't know, that might be a bridge to MacIntyre and you.
Maybe. I guess I would see MacIntyre as disagreeing pretty vehemently with the social self-determination theorist. Was that the direction you were thinking? Yeah, because he was very big on the communal side of things.
Yeah.
And one of my criticisms of self-determination theory is that it's too individually focused. And they'll say, "Oh, but we have a social dimension." And I'll say, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And they say, "We mean all these things." And I'm saying, maybe we should talk about all these things as one at a time, rather than just one big category. So I've had a lot of interesting dialogue back and forth with those folks, and I really respect their work. I mean, it's great because some people think that humanists never do research. At least in the United States, that's a knock against them. They're humanists, and they've done a ton of research. And so their idea of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is really important. If you take a child who's doing something they find valuable and start to give them money or rewards for it, they stop doing it unless you give them the rewards, because they start to get confused about why they're doing it. And I think that's a really important thing. And it gets to part of what Otti was bringing up about institutions and corruption, is that I think we get confused about what the real goals are. And if we start to think the goals are all outcomes, then we forget about the constitutive aims that we have, and we focus on the outcomes. One of the examples that I'll give about that frequently is at least in the United States, the court system is adversarial, and it's focused more on the conflict between the defense and the prosecution, or the plaintiffs, than it is on what's really true. So each side tries to portray it the best they can. But if you take a prosecutor and the police and you confuse them about what the proper outcome of their work is, in other words, you get them to think that convictions is the most important outcome and closing cases is the most important outcome, you're going to see a lot of injustice.
Yeah.
Because they're gonna start thinking that's what they need to do, and so they use any means they can to get to that end. If you help them to remember that justice is the point of their activity, or public safety is the point of their activity, then they're going to orient themselves in a very different way. And I think some of the struggles we're having with police and prosecution in the United States come down to that. There are other things as well, like racial bias, for example, but one of them is, and sometimes those things go together. There was a police department in my county in Florida, a city police department that had a 100% conviction rate. Every crime in that jurisdiction was solved. And you know how they did it? They just roped people into being convicted of the crimes. They used all kinds of terrible means, including coerced convictions and made up evidence and withholding evidence, all those things, because they were confused about what it was they were supposed to be doing.
But see, Blaine, you brought it together nicely, because that's indeed all research also by economists who talk about crowding out. So I guess even of virtues, we do find a bridge here.
Well, let me just add one bit to that, because I think this confusion is really important, because it explains a lot of the way things go wrong. And it also is because as human beings, we are easily confused. We can fool ourselves into thinking one thing when really we should be thinking about a different thing, that our goal is A when our goal really should be B. And we see that throughout history, and we see horrendous examples of it. I mean, I'm just talking about people being put in jail, but we could talk about genocides, and we could talk about empire building and slaughter and on a very large scale. It's really important to understand that there's a dark side to being human, and that we can go deeply, horribly wrong. And so that's part of why it's so important to keep this focus on how do we get it right. And one of the guidelines for getting it right is thinking about how is it that people do in this organization or under this regime or with this community. Are we doing well or not? And if we're not, we need to pay attention to that.
And here I would just add, and that's why we also have to care about how we craft the institution. I'm not kind of, it's always bad, but we have to really be careful. But I also heard here the development and the cultivating in what you were saying. And I think we have some questions left there, or a lot of questions. I just start with one, because I was digging and I found a new book by Kurzner, it's called, and he really went back to the moral development model of Aristotle himself. It was a little bit shocking to me, because in the end, pain is a really essential component, or it's more precisely, it's about if you want to be this continent human being, then punishment is the first thing. Then it's about internalized fear of punishment. Then it's about remorse. What do you make out of that development theory? Is that something where you would say, I'm not going to follow Aristotle here, we can do it better, and we do it this and this way?
Well, it's like everything. It depends on how you take that. I mean, I'll just tell you a funny story. Quick funny story is at my son's bar mitzvah, he was to read a portion of the Torah that had to do with stoning children. And these children were directed to be stoned because they disobeyed their parents. And so my son read this, and we're all like, we're shocked about of course it's part of the Torah and it's part of the history and the tradition, but we're like, who wants to stone children? And the rabbi got up and said, well, the good news is we've never had such disobedient children. So it's kind of how you take these things. And what does punishment and pain mean? Those are very different things. I mean, every parent uses all kinds of things to help their children grow up to be good people. And sometimes punishment or pain would be it. That doesn't mean you're hitting them, but maybe you disapprove, or maybe you disengage, or maybe you explain that that's not such a good way to think about things. So these things can be done very gently. They don't have to be done the physical way we often think of punishment. And as a psychologist, I'm a true believer in non-physical punishment, because we found that creates all kinds of negativities that we don't really want. The thing is Aristotle didn't have a really well worked out program for how to cultivate virtue. He had a few ideas, and it's Howard Kurtzer, right? That you're talking about? Yeah. So Howard did his best to best version of exegesis and of fleshing out things and using some psychological research and so on to try to salvage what Aristotle provides. I think that developmental researchers these days know more than Aristotle did about child rearing. And I think we can learn a lot from developmentalists. I mean, some are psychologists, some aren't. So there are lots of things that children want to comply in general. And if they're given a good environment in which compliance makes great sense and helps them to bond with their caregiver, they're going to tend to do that. You're not going to need a lot of punishment. So it's called, the term is called committed compliance. And they'll do things that you expect them to do even when you're not watching. And so there are other things like the research on imitation. Children learn things from their caregivers. They're very attuned to how adults do things, and they will tend to do things just the way the adult does them, which is a very scary thought if you're a parent, because there were so many things I didn't want my children to learn, but they did. But that's just being an imperfect human being, and I've had to try to forgive myself for all that.
But there's more to that, isn't there? Because I mean, the marriage, so to speak, of psychology and philosophy, I think, is a very important one. And I have also thought many times that they look at very similar things with very different vocabulary, which is not always helpful, and a lot of skepticism towards each other's. But especially in this, I wanted to come back to this concept of identity that I find very interesting. Equally, you're quoting Bion in your book about attachment theory, which of course is also immensely interesting, because especially insecure attachment stays us with kind of through our lives. And if people are not aware of insecure attachment, it can really create all sorts of problems for them, not least not being able to fully assess situations within which they find themselves. So identity you describe as a necessity for collaboration, because only then we can become responsible and accountable, because we are different from the in-group. You also describe the extended self and the social identity, and you kind of put a lot of emphasis on the fact that, as many psychologists would agree, identity is a relational concept. Identity only makes sense in the context of others, but even more so, we are part of the community, like you say, before we even emerge as an identity, and the community is in us, right? So it's a iterative, a circular concept to a degree. But I wonder, so if today we're finding ourselves at the end of evolution, so to speak, and in what Putnam calls a very I society, right, with consumerism and individualism at the very height, then clearly something isn't going well in people acknowledging the shared identity, the social identity that they carry. So again, to Antoinette's point about education or development, what is it what is it we need to do in order to at least give them that option to see beyond themselves? What would be transformational in your mind?
Well, I think just being true to this concept of social identity. So again, in a way, it's taking the good seriously. So is it good for me to think that I'm really separate and autonomous and distinct from everyone else? And that's the real reality. And that's what individualism teaches. So it's huge in the United States. And I think it's pretty big in North Atlantic societies in general. So what we need to do is to recognize that individual that's so highly esteemed and so central is a creation of the group. So no one is born as a distinct, separate, autonomous individual. They have to be made into one. And so what we need to do, I think, is partly teach our children how important their relationships are, teach our children how much who they are is a matter of who they're with. And that, by the way, is a really important lesson for children to learn as they grow up, because at least in my experience, as they become adolescents, who they're with is mostly what matters. And arranging those, helping children to pick the best sorts of companions is one of the most important things parents can do in that period. But that's an example of this. So to pick companions and situations in which they're going to be their best selves, as opposed to situations in which they're drawn to be less good than they could otherwise be. So I'll give a personal example here. My son had a friend that he really liked and spent a lot of time with. The kid was really bright, but really troubled as well. And so one day I came home from work and I talked to my son, and he was very irritable with me and very nasty. And I said, "Oh, I'll just use a fake name here. Have you just been on the phone with Miguel?" And he said, "Yeah, how did you know?" He says, "You only act this way after you talk with him. You don't act this way any other time." And he took that to heart. And before long, Miguel was not very central in his life anymore, because he understood that this individual brought out the worst in him. And it's not that my son can't be irritable and difficult. He can. Took after his father, I guess. But the upshot was that helped him to pick better friends. And we did a lot of other things besides that. And I think in life in general, we're picking who we spend time with and what settings we spend our time in. And it's very important to think about that as part of how we make a good life. Because I don't get to decide when I go to a party or to a work meeting, I don't get to decide what that is, but I can decide that, maybe this workplace is really toxic and difficult, and it makes me into a very competitive and vicious kind of striver, that I don't want to live that way, and maybe I need a different environment. And so we can sometimes make those choices. On the other hand, maybe we can help to change that environment. So there's a lot of different ways this can go, but the environment is extremely important. And if the shared identity I develop by being a part of certain groups leads in a direction that is inimical to a good life, then I need to take a step back from that. So I'm mixing in here all kinds of things with identity, reflection, agency. It's a very complex picture, but I can't think of how to respond to your question without bringing up all of it.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting one, and I'll hand over to Antoinette for what I think the final question. But I think what you're saying is identity is relational. We are what our relationships are to a degree, and I think that reminds me of Quantum Leadership by Dana Zohar, where she's saying the same thing from a system theory perspective. We are our relationships, therefore we should choose our relationships wisely, which I think is a kind of almost an old saying. But Antoinette, I think final question over to you, and then we're almost at the end.
Small lightning quiz to end with. I was kind of wondering, given that this is the natural tendency of us, it seems to be that we have to rediscover our social orientation. So this is something which we had, and we have to kind of keep it or nourish it over our life. But what we have to cultivate is practical wisdom. I mean, the reasoning part, because I also know that some deontological virtue scholars, that's the reason why they say it's just too complicated, it's too intellectual, this Aristotelian virtue ethic. Can't we make it a little bit easier? But I mean, is that a correct assumption? So we kind of have to keep our social side on the one hand, but then work our whole life to develop this practical wisdom?
Well, what I was shaking my head at is that I don't think practical wisdom is that intellectualized. Now, if you look at the wisdom research in psychology, it tends to focus on knowledge, cognition, and metacognition. So I think that criticism is apt for the wisdom literature. but the wisdom literature is not practical wisdom. It's not phronesis. And so we're just starting to study phronesis now. Up until now, it's been very different. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you I don't see the two as incompatible at all. And let me try to give you some reasons to believe what I'm saying there. One is that when we talk about maintaining our social identities, our shared identities, they're already there. What we have to do is just notice them, and we have to prioritize them. That's the difference. And so if you're in a culture that really valorizes and emphasizes the individual, then those just get pushed aside and made secondary. So an individualist perspective sees relationships as secondary to the primary individual. So we're first individuals, and then we can add a relationship or group element to that. I think that's mistaken. I think that the relationship and group element is already in us, and the thing is to notice that. Now we're also individuals, but we're members of groups and relationships at the same time. And both of those have important elements in terms of how we live. Second thing, so again, it's not that something we've lost, it's something we've just deprioritized. And one of the things that practical wisdom does is it prioritizes what's important. So, and that's one of the ways in which it's not just an intellectual exercise, but it's what is most important here in this situation that I need to respond to in order to live well as a human being. That's how I understand practical wisdom. And so it's, again, all about what we love, what we value, what we think is important. And then we can think about how might I best do that? And that could be intellectualized, but it doesn't have to be, because again, we want our actions to be thoroughly imbued both with affect and with cognition. So we want our cognition to help guide us to the best way to think about things and do things, but we want to also have our hearts in it. We want to care about what we're doing. We don't want to do it just as a matter of grim duty or because someone said we should, but we want to believe that it's something worth doing. The final reason I would say they're not incompatible is that practical wisdom is a very social concept. That a lot of the deliberation and deciding we do is with others, because we always have to coordinate our actions with other people. So if I come up with the wisest, best thing to do all by myself, and no one around me has any understanding of that, they're going to think I'm just kind of going off on my own direction and not really paying attention to them. But if I think that there's a way to think about things, I need to talk to them about it. We need to coordinate our actions. I need their input because maybe I missed something. I usually do. Most individuals do. So a group coming together to deliberate has a lot of strengths. I mean, you can go wrong with that. And then finally, the other way that practical wisdom is social is that we're always basing this on shared expectations and norms and what seems right in our particular group and culture. So it's, even if we wanted to do it entirely individual, we couldn't, because all of the elements of what we're working with are things that are socially put together.
I think that, and maybe here Antoinette will lead us into the closing quiz, just a minute of any answers that come to your mind. But I wanted to bring together 3 thoughts on what you just said. I think what comes to my mind is one, in terms of acknowledging, being able in the situation to choose the best course of action that leads to goodness, so to speak. I think acknowledging who you are yourself becomes very important. I think with Bill Torbett, we spoke a lot about that. Caring and externally considering ever greater implications and constituencies. Carol Sanford was very keen on that notion that we care how to make other people flourish. And I'm almost thinking, bridging back to McIntyre and institution. Henry Mintzberg told us last week that the manager is one of the most important roles in society. And I think what he meant, and clearly not subscribing to McIntyre's criticism of management, what he meant is a good manager, a good leader is an institutional caretaker, someone who creates a good, as Antoinette said, crafts the institution in such a way that it creates the container and also the developmental journey for the individuals within that to acquire that phronesis that you talked about together, because I really believe you're making a very important point. And thinking about Yalom and group psychotherapy, most of these things we learn together. Learning about ourselves and how to best interact with our environment is probably something that in solidarity groups, in peer groups, can be best attained, and not so much by studying ourselves in the ivory tower. So again, I think maybe there are some linkages that we can explore further. So thank you very much. And that brings us to the quiz, Antoinette.
So the idea of the quiz is that you just very instantaneously or spontaneously answer, and we'll find out whether there are answers you can also pass, of course. So the first question is, you can choose to have dinner and a long conversation, and you just have to choose among the following: A, the wife of Aristotle; B, Deirdre McCloskey; C, Greta Thunberg; or Simone de Beauvoir.
What was B? I didn't hear B.
Deirdre McCloskey.
Oh, I don't know who that is. Sorry. I would probably just pick wife of Aristotle.
Okay. Yeah, that would be an interesting conversation, I guess. So
it would be, yeah.
on many planes. So what is the biggest problem with society today? Lack of love, the narcissism epidemic, or goldfish-sized attention spans?
What was the first one again? I missed.
A lack of love.
I'm really torn between B and C because I think both are big problems. I mean, and 20 years ago, I wouldn't have said C, I would have said B. But I think the social media and the internet has really helped to decrease our willingness to pay attention to things for long periods and focus. Yeah. Okay.
Then the biggest change needed in psychology, or where does it come from? The replication crisis, the fact-value dichotomy, or the lack of willingness to lead a dialogue outside narrow silence?
Wow, that's a tough one. All three are such serious problems. I guess if I'm doing a knee-jerk response, it would be the fact-value dichotomy, because that's something that I've focused a lot of my attention on. In a word, I think it's a false dichotomy.
Okay, we take it. And it was a little bit to be expected. So your most important tip to enable personal happiness would be?
Oh, this is open-ended?
Yeah.
Identify good things to love.
Good. And then the last question is, if I could change one thing in the world to make it a better place, what would it be?
Wow.
You thought we would close you out with easy questions, Blaine, didn't you?
Yeah, one thing. Wow, that's really tough. I guess if one thing is if we would become better able to pick the best leaders.
Oh. It's probably a very important one, yes.
It really is, because I agree with what Otti was saying about a leader being someone who crafts an organization to bring out the best in the people in it. And bad leaders craft organizations to bring out the worst in the people. We've just had a very big experience with that the second kind of leadership in the United States. Now, of course, some people would disagree with me about which one was the bad leader, but I think very few people around the world would.
Well, I think you're safe in Europe, that we're all on exactly your side.
Yep.
At least most of us. But then I'm speaking to you from London, so I think with the question is, with what moral high ground can I make that assertion? I don't know. But one other thing that final thought, I think Antoinette and I really appreciated your work on civic friendship, and the way that you looked into friendship in Aristotle, which I think is such a powerful concept. And one thing that stuck with me was this notion it's not only about having friends, it's about learning to be a friend. And I think if we could all learn, and I thank you very much for being a friend, Blaine, for spending the time with us. If we could learn to be better friends, maybe we would make this world a little better as well. And in that regard, thanks for being part of it. It has been brilliant, and it's been very, very nice to speak to the person who has written all the book that we have read through the last week. So thank you again on behalf of both of us. And we will certainly reach out to your network. And again, thanks for holding the space for some of those questions to be debated together. Antoinette, maybe final word to you, and then over Blaine for a final salute.
Well, nothing to add. That were beautiful last words from our side. Just really looking forward, hoping that we stay in contact. But I have nothing to add to these nice words.
Well, let me just say it's been an enormously good time for me to talk with you. I mean, you're careful, thoughtful readers. You have great questions. And to me, there's, it's one of the things that I love doing the most is talking about these issues. And so talking with people who are thinking hard about them and open-minded is just a tremendous pleasure. So thank you for that.
Thanks again.